You know, I was never the kind of woman who needed to be the center of anything. Ask anyone who knew me during my 31 years as a nurse. I was the one who stayed late, who held hands in the dark, who slipped out quietly after a shift without waiting to be thanked. That was just how I was built. So when my daughter-in-law met me at the entrance of that garden venue with her arms crossed and her voice low, I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just stood there in my cream-colored dress and my good pearl earrings, and I listened. "Daniel wanted me to be the one to tell you," Susan said, not quite meeting my eyes. "He's asking that you please not make this about yourself. Like you did at the baptism. Like I did at the baptism. I had driven 9 hours to get there. Left my house at 4 in the morning, stopped twice for gas, once for a restroom, ate half a granola bar over the steering wheel, somewhere in the middle of Tennessee. I had the gift in the back seat. A card with a check inside. A $75,000 I had been building since Claire was 7 years old and told me she wanted to get married somewhere with flowers and a fountain. I had remembered that. I always remembered. I looked past Susan toward the white tent where the music was already starting and the guests were already filing in. I could see the edge of Claire's veil through the opening. Just the edge. I nodded once. The way you nod when there is nothing left to say that anyone will hear. Then I walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. The sun was already warm for May, and the inside of the car smelled like the travel mug I'd packed with coffee from home. I reached into the back seat, took the card out of the gift bag, and put it in my purse. Just held the purse in my lap like an anchor. The baptism. I need to tell you about the baptism so you understand. 2 years ago, Daniel and Susan had their youngest son, Owen, baptized at their church in Asheville. I had flown in, paid for the flight myself, bought the silver cross necklace they asked for from the list Susan sent. During the reception at their house, I made the mistake of mentioning to their pastor that Daniel used to be afraid of water as a boy, that he used to cry at bath time until he was nearly 4. I said it with a smile. It was a fond memory. It was my memory of my son. Susan had pulled me aside afterward and told me that I had humiliated him, that I always found a way to make other people's moments about my history, that Daniel had spent years trying to separate who he was from where he came from, and I kept dragging the past into every room I entered. I didn't argue then either. I flew home the next morning and I cried in the airport bathroom, and then I straightened myself out and boarded the plane. Now I was in a parking lot in North Carolina, and my granddaughter was getting married 50 yards away, and I was sitting in a rented Honda with a check for $75,000 in my purse. I drove to the motel I had booked for the weekend. It was clean, modest, smelled like lemon disinfectant. I hung the dress in the closet, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for a while. I wasn't crying. I think I had used up the crying at the baptism. What I felt now was something quieter than grief and heavier than anger. It felt like the moment you finally understand something you should have understood a long time ago. My phone buzzed around 9 that evening. A text from my grandson Tommy, Daniel's older boy, 23 and living with 2 roommates in Charlotte. "Did you make it okay? I heard you were in town." I stared at the message. Then I typed back. "I was there. Didn't go in. Long story." "I'm fine," he replied immediately. "What happened?" I didn't answer that night. In the morning, I checked out early, loaded the car, and began the drive home. Somewhere around the Georgia line, I pulled off at a diner and ordered eggs I didn't eat and coffee I drank too fast. I opened the card from my purse and looked at my own handwriting one more time. For Claire and Marcus, with all my love and everything I saved for this day. I had written it 2 weeks before. I had meant every word. I folded the card in half and slid it back into the envelope. Then I put the envelope back in my purse. I got home just after dark. My house in Knoxville looked the same as it always did. Porch light on, flower boxes a little overgrown, the faint creak of the gate when I pushed it open. I left my suitcase by the door and sat at the kitchen table and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. I thought about who I was before Daniel had learned to be ashamed of me. I had raised him alone for most of it, if we are being honest. My husband, Gerald, was a good man, but a quiet one. He worked the line at the tire plant for 22 years and came home tired, and he loved us in the only way he knew how, which was mostly by showing up and not leaving. When he died of a stroke in the driveway 11 years ago, Daniel was 41 and already too busy to fly home for 2 of the 3 days I needed him. He made it for the funeral and left the morning after. I didn't say anything about that. What was there to say? What I did instead was keep going. I worked another 4 years at the hospital, past when most people in my unit had retired, because the work gave me a reason to get up, and because I was still good at it. I retired at 68, with a pension that was enough to live on simply, and a savings account I had fed carefully for decades. Gerald's life insurance had added to it. I didn't spend extravagantly. I didn't take cruises. I kept a garden and I drove the same car until it stopped being worth repairing. And every birthday and Christmas and graduation, I made sure the people I loved felt it. I thought about all of that at my kitchen table that night. Then I went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. I had always kept records. It was the nurse in me. You document. You write things down. You do not trust memory, because memory is kind to the wrong moments. I pulled out the folder marked Daniel and set it on the table. The first paper was from 2004, a personal check for $12,000, the down payment gap when Daniel and Susan were buying their first house and fell 3 months short. He had called it a loan. I had let him call it that because it seemed to matter to him. He never paid it back. There was no follow-up from him. I had noted it at the bottom in pencil, unpaid as of December 2005. Stopped asking. Behind that, a receipt from 2009. A private tutor for Claire, 3 years of twice-weekly sessions after her school flagged her for reading difficulties. $9,000 across the time I paid it. Daniel had mentioned once that tutors were expensive. I had said, "Let me take care of it." He said thank you. That one time, he never mentioned it again. Then a printout from 2011. My co-signature on Daniel's business loan when he and a partner were opening a landscaping company, $42,000. The business lasted 18 months. He told me the market dried up. I absorbed the hit to my credit and never once brought it up because he already seemed embarrassed enough. I kept going through the folder. Summer camps for Tommy and Claire. A car repair for Susan after the accident on the bypass. An emergency wire when Daniel's checking account went negative the month after Owen was born. Small things, large things, things I no longer even remembered sending until I saw the paper. By the time I finished sorting, the kitchen table looked like a map of my generosity, and I sat looking at it for a long time. I thought about what Daniel had told someone at Tommy's college graduation 2 years ago. I had overheard it without meaning to, standing around the corner in the hallway. He was talking to one of his golfing friends, and he said, "My mother was a nurse. She's retired now. Comfortable. She never really had to worry. Never really had to worry." As if comfort was something that had simply happened to me. As if I hadn't stood on linoleum floors for 8-hour shifts until my feet ached past the kind of ache aspirin can reach. I did not sleep well that night, but by morning I knew what I needed to do. I called my bank at 8:30, as soon as they opened. I asked to speak with my account manager, a steady woman named Linda who had handled my accounts for 6 years. When she answered, I said, "Linda, I need to stop a payment and make some changes." She asked which payment. I told her about the recurring monthly transfer I had set up the year before, $400 a month into an account Daniel had access to, something we had arranged when he was between contracts and struggling to cover the kids' extracurriculars. I had meant it as a temporary thing. It had been going for 14 months. "Stop it," I said. "Effective today." "Done," she said, without hesitation. "Anything else?" "I also co-signed on a home equity line of credit for him last year," I said. "I need to understand my options for removing myself." She explained the process carefully. It would take paperwork and Daniel's cooperation, but she could start it from my end. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I picked up the phone again and called my attorney. Howard had been handling my legal affairs since Gerald died. He was methodical and unhurried, the kind of man who did not fill silence with noise. When I told him I wanted to update my will, he said, "Of course, when can you come in?" I said, "Can you do Thursday?" He could. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday going through the rest of my files. I had a retirement account, the pension, the savings, Gerald's policy proceeds, and the house, which had appreciated more than I expected over the years. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, the result of a lifetime of careful choices made by two quiet people who believed in keeping more than they spent. My will had left everything evenly split between Daniel and a charitable fund I had named years ago for a pediatric ward at my former hospital. I had thought it was fair. I had thought Daniel deserved to share in what his parents had built. But there is a difference between what someone deserves and what they have earned through the way they have treated you, and somewhere along the way I had confused the two. On Wednesday evening, Tommy knocked on my door. He did not call first. He just drove the 2.5 hours from Charlotte and knocked. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like he had been rehearsing something the whole drive and had now forgotten the words. "Grandma," he said. "Come in," I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had spread out all of Daniel's papers 2 nights before. I had put the folder away, but I could feel it in the room, the way you can feel something even after it's been set aside. Tommy told me that Claire had noticed my car in the parking lot and had asked Susan about it during the reception, that Claire had not known I had been turned away, that when she found out, she cried. He said it in the way young people say difficult things all at once, as if slowness would make it harder. "Did Claire tell your father?" I asked. He nodded. They had a fight about it Sunday night, the kind of fight that probably needed to happen 10 years ago. I looked at Tommy. He had Gerald's coloring, the same steady brown eyes. He had always been the quieter of the two children, less dazzling than Claire, less driven than Daniel wanted him to be. I had always liked that about him. "I'm sorry you drove all this way," I said. He shook his head. "I'm sorry you drove 9 hours and sat in a parking lot." We did not say much after that for a while. I made tea. He drank it, even though I could tell he wasn't much of a tea drinker. At some point, I told him about the check, the $75,000, what I had intended it for. "She would have wanted you there," he said. "Claire, whatever she said about keeping the peace, she would have wanted you there." "I know," I said. "But it doesn't change what was said." He nodded slowly. I could see him understanding it in real time, the way young people sometimes arrive at adult comprehension right in front of you, like watching a door open. Before he left, I walked him to his car. The night was warm and clear, and my neighbor's wisteria was blooming over the fence the way it did every May, relentless and sweet. Tommy stopped at the car door and looked at me. "Grandma," he said, "whatever you decide to do, I want you to know, you are not invisible to me. You never were." I reached up and put my hand briefly on his face, the way you do with people you have loved since they were small. "Drive safe," I said. After he left, I went back inside and I sat in the chair by the window, Gerald's old chair with the reupholstered arms, and I let myself feel all of it. Not with drama, not with weeping. Just let it move through me the way you let cold water move through your hands, feeling it fully before it goes. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully and drove to Howard's office downtown. The updated will took 40 minutes to draft the framework. I removed Daniel as a beneficiary. I directed the house and the liquid assets to Tommy, with 20% designated to the pediatric fund. I left Susan nothing. I left a note in the document, not angry, just clear. Howard read it twice and then looked at me over his glasses. "You're sure about Daniel?" "I'm sure," I said. "He's had years to understand who I am." He chose a different story. Howard nodded and kept writing. When I left his office, I did not feel lighter exactly. I felt accurate, like I had described something that had always been true, had just never been written down properly before. I drove home the long way, past the hospital where I had worked for so many years. I didn't stop, just slowed down long enough to see the parking structure, the blue awning over the main entrance, the small memorial garden they had planted when the children's wing was renovated. I had been one of the nurses who raised money for that renovation. I had baked for every fundraiser, written every grant letter, donated the first check myself. My name was on a small tile near the garden bench. I thought about what I wanted to do next. That evening, I called the nursing program at the local community college. She transferred me to the department chair, a man named Professor Ellis, who listened carefully and said, "Mrs. Callahan, what you're describing would be meaningful to a great many students. I want it private," I said. "No naming rights, no announcements. I want the recipient selected based on financial need and a written statement about why they chose nursing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think we can do that." We set a meeting for the following week. When I hung up, I wrote the amount at the top of a blank notepad. $40,000 to start. Renewable. Enough to cover 2 years of tuition and books for someone who might otherwise have to choose between the work they were meant for and the money they did not have. I thought about myself at 23, sitting in my first pediatrics rotation, understanding for the first time that this was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I wanted someone else to have that moment, without the weight of debt pressing down on it. The calls from Daniel started on Friday. "Mom, I don't know exactly what Susan said to you, but I want to talk about it." "Mom, I heard about the bank transfer. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Mom." The equity line sent me a notice. "Can you call me back?" I listened to each voicemail in full. I did not call back. I did write him one text after the fourth message, which said, "I heard what was said. I am not confused about what happened. I need some time." He replied within a minute. "You're overreacting." I turned the phone face down on the counter and went to water my garden. The letter came on a Tuesday in June, about 6 weeks after I had met with Professor Ellis and finalized the scholarship details. Plain envelope, first-class stamp, the return address, a campus post office box. The handwriting was careful, the pen slightly smudged on the T's, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who still thinks about how they form their letters. "Dear Scholarship Committee, my name is Renee. I grew up in Morristown. My mom cleans offices at night, and my stepdad is between work. I applied to the nursing program because my little brother Marcus was in the ICU for 11 days. When he was 6, and there was a nurse there, an older woman with short gray hair who sat with me in the hallway when my mom had to go handle the insurance calls. She didn't say anything particularly profound. She just sat there so I wasn't alone. I was 12. I have never forgotten her, and I still don't know her name. I want to be the person who sits in the hallway for someone else. I want to do the work that doesn't get applauded, but gets remembered. Thank you for believing that someone like me can do it. Renee. I read it twice at the kitchen table. Then, I read it again. I sat for a long time after that, the letter in my hands, thinking about that nurse, whoever she was, the one who had sat in a hallway with a 12-year-old girl and not said anything profound, just been present, just showed up. That is the whole job sometimes. The showing up. That afternoon, I wrote a note on a plain card I pulled from the drawer. Dear Renee, I read what you wrote. The nurse in the hallway recognized something in you worth waiting for. So do I. This isn't charity. It's one person seeing another clearly. Make something of it. Someone who believes the quiet ones do the most lasting work. I didn't sign it. I mailed it through Professor Ellis's office so there was no return address she could trace. Tommy came by again the last weekend of June with a pizza he had picked up on the way in, the kind with too much cheese that I never buy for myself and always enjoy when someone else brings it. We sat on the back porch and ate out of the box and watched the light change on the garden. He told me that Daniel and Susan had argued again, more seriously this time, that Claire had also said things to Daniel that had apparently needed saying for years, that the family had become, as Tommy put it, a lot more honest lately. Does that feel like progress? I asked. He thought about it. He shrugged. It feels like something that should have started earlier. I agreed with that. I asked him about his own life. He had changed jobs recently, was working at an architecture firm now, designing residential spaces. Small ones, he said, affordable housing projects mostly. He talked about it with his hands. The way people do when they actually love what they're doing. When the work hasn't yet made them tired. I listened for a long time. I hadn't had someone in my kitchen talking about their actual life in longer than I could easily measure. Before he left, he asked, "Do you think you'll ever talk to Dad again?" "For real, I mean." "I think so," I said. "When I'm ready, not to forgive a version of events that isn't true, but eventually, yes." He nodded. "That's fair. Is it enough?" I asked. "Not him understanding things after the fact?" He looked at me steadily. "I think sometimes that's all you get," he said. "People understand things late. That's not nothing." I thought about that for days afterward. Daniel called on a Wednesday in July. Not a voicemail this time. He called 3 times in a row, which is the signal we had established years ago for something urgent, back when Gerald was sick, and there might be a reason to pick up immediately. I answered. There was a pause on his end, like he hadn't expected me to. "Mom, I'm here. I don't know how to start this." "Then start badly," I said. "That's still starting." Another pause. He exhaled. "I shouldn't have let Susan handle that. At the wedding. I knew you were coming, and I didn't come outside myself, and I should have. That was wrong." I didn't say anything. He continued. He stopped. "I think I've been ashamed of things I shouldn't be ashamed of. Where I grew up. How things were. That last word landed in my chest, with a weight that surprised me. "Why?" I asked. I had to ask. After all these years, I had to know. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you made it look easy." He said it slowly, like he was figuring it out as he spoke. "You always did everything, and you never acted like it cost you anything, and it made me feel like I was supposed to do the same, and I couldn't, and somehow I made that your fault." I held the phone and looked out the window at the wisteria, which had gone green now, the blooms long finished. "It cost me everything," I said quietly. "I just didn't tell you." He didn't speak for a while. I could hear him breathing, the slight thickness in it that told me he was trying not to come apart on a Wednesday afternoon over the telephone. "I know," he said finally. "I know that now." We did not resolve everything on that call. There were no grand declarations, no tearful reunions, no promises made that would only strain under their own weight. We talked for 20 minutes. I told him I had changed the will. I told him directly and calmly, and I told him it was not done out of spite but out of necessity. He listened without arguing. That itself was something new. At the end he said, "Can I come see you?" "Not yet," I said. "But I'll let you know when I'm ready." He said okay. He didn't push. That was the thing I hadn't expected. That when the leverage was gone, when there was nothing left to gain from the relationship, and he was still calling, still asking to come, the reason had to be something else, something that had been there under all the rest of it, buried, but still alive. I thought about that for a while after I hung up. about how people can contain contradictions, about how you can love someone and make them smaller at the same time, without meaning to, without fully knowing. About how understanding doesn't undo damage, but it does change what you do with it. I opened my journal that night. I keep a small one on the nightstand, the kind with a blue canvas cover. Gerald gave me the first one the year we married. I've gone through 8 since then. I wrote, I am 68 years old, and I have finally stopped explaining myself to people who were not listening. I am not what I was made to feel I was. I am not an embarrassment or a reminder or a burden or background noise. I am the woman who sat in the hallway so no one would be alone. I am the one who saved for 13 years for a wedding I did not get to attend. I am the one who turned the check into something that will put a young woman through nursing school. I have not disappeared. I have just redirected. I closed the journal. Outside, the night was quiet and thick with summer. Somewhere, a neighbor's wind chimes were moving, that soft, irregular percussion that says there's a breeze you can't quite feel yet. In September, Professor Ellis sent me a photograph through his campus email account. He had asked permission from the student, and she had agreed. It was Renee, at her orientation, standing with a group of other first-year students in the college courtyard. She was wearing a backpack with a small sunflower pin on the strap. She was not performing joy for the camera. She was just present in it, in the way that people are when they know they have arrived somewhere real. Professor Ellis's email said, she mentioned in her orientation statement that she had received a letter from her donor. She said she had it folded in her wallet. She said she took it out when she felt uncertain and read the last line. The quiet ones do the most lasting work. I had to put the computer down and go stand in the kitchen for a while. I made myself a cup of tea. I stood at the window and looked at the yard, at the flower boxes that needed deadheading, at the garden gate Gerald had built from cedar planks in 1989 and that still held, still swung clean on its hinges. I thought about all the things that persist without asking to be noticed, roots, foundations, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. I thought about the 12-year-old Renee in a hospital hallway, about the nurse who sat down next to her and didn't say anything particularly profound, about how that nurse, whoever she was, had probably gone home that evening without knowing what she had planted. You never know what you're planting. I went back to the computer and opened a new message to Professor Ellis. Please tell her, I wrote, that the feeling is mutual. Then I closed the laptop and went outside to deadhead the flowers before the light was gone. Tommy came by in October with apple cider and 2 cups. We sat on the porch in jackets. The trees on my street had gone amber and red, and the air had that clean, pointed smell that October gets in the mountains, the smell that means something is ending and something else is being prepared. He showed me a photo on his phone. Claire, at the new house she and Marcus had moved into after the wedding, standing in the kitchen with flour on her sleeve, laughing at something off camera. She looks happy, I said. She is, he said. She asks about you. Tell her she can call me, I said. Anytime. He smiled. I will. We sat for a while after that without needing to fill it. That's the thing about people who have actually been through something together, even from different sides of it. The silence has a texture. It holds what you don't say. At some point, Tommy said, You seem different. Different how? I asked. Like you're not bracing for anything, he said. Like you've stopped waiting for the next thing to ask something of you. I turned that over. He wasn't wrong. There had been something I'd been carrying for so long. I had forgotten I was carrying it. The readiness to be needed, the posture of a person who has made themselves indispensable, because indispensable is the closest they've been allowed to get to loved. I had set that down somewhere in the last few months. I wasn't sure exactly when. Maybe in the parking lot in North Carolina. Maybe at Howard's desk. Maybe the morning I read Renee's letter and understood that giving something away freely, without the hope of being thanked for it, was the only kind of giving that had ever really filled me. Before Tommy left, he stood at the porch steps and looked at me with Gerald's steady eyes and said, "I'm glad you're okay, Grandma." "I'm more than okay," I said. And I meant it. That night I sat in Gerald's chair by the window with the lamp on, and no television, no phone, no noise, just the room and the lamp, and the sound of the street outside settling into evening. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this year, and the woman I was now. I had not transformed. I had not become unrecognizable. I was still the woman who kept files, who noted unpaid loans in pencil, who drove 9 hours for someone she loved. I was still the woman who remembered Claire saying she wanted a fountain and flowers when she was 7 years old. But I was also now the woman who had said enough, who had picked up all the paper evidence of her own worth and looked at it clearly and decided that her history deserved to be honored, even if the people she had given it to could not yet see it that way. I was not waiting anymore. I was not bracing. I was not managing. I was not making myself small so that someone else could feel large. I was sitting in my chair in my house at the end of a season that had asked everything of me, and I was still here, and the lamp was warm, and somewhere in Morristown, a young woman named Renee had a note folded in her wallet and was learning, one shift at a time, to be the person who sits down in the hallway so someone else doesn't have to be alone. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. If you've ever been the one who showed up and wasn't let in, the one who gave and wasn't seen, the one who was too much of a reminder of where someone came from, then you already know what I know, that your worth was never in their keeping. It was yours the whole time. You just had to stop handing it over long enough to notice. Leave a comment if any part of this reached you. And if you're new here, welcome to Stories of Melanie, where we tell the truths that don't always make it to the dinner table. Follow along. There are more stories where this one came from.